Nick, how are you doing today?
I am outstanding, Amy. How are you doing?
And I am here with a nice little warmed up cup of sugar cookie wine. It comes from a local vineyard here, and I thought the weather was getting better, but it is now cold and raining. I said, you know what, this is perfect for a little warm wine weather.
Absolutely. I chose to go with a whiskey sour today. It looked very similar to one of the cocktails you have on our intro.
Yeah, I need to make mimosas because that's
Oh, yeah.
from our intro.
Okay.
But that's going to be for another day. We are here today to talk about NATO. You and I are both very familiar with NATO, and
Yep.
your background, particularly having been a foreign affairs officer, lends a lot to this. So give us the rundown, the history of NATO and why it matters.
Yeah, so NATO was formed in 1949, and it's really important to understand why it was formed. It was a collective security organization from the very beginning, targeting, trying to defend Western Europe from the new Soviet threat that had emerged post World War II. The Soviet Union predates World War II, but as Stalin emerged onto the global scene following the war, it was much more of a global threat, a global presence, and from the perspective of the West, a threat to the Western way of life. So that was what drove NATO, and I would be remiss if I didn't say what frustrates a lot of people about NATO is that it is a consensus organization, which means everybody has to agree. If a single person disagrees, that is effectively a veto. So every country in NATO effectively has a veto. And I can say firsthand, and I'm sure you can too, that is a frustrating aspect of it. It lends itself to a lot more discussion and debate rather than decisive action, although it certainly is capable of decisive action. For example, the one and only time Article 5 was invoked, which is the collective defense article of the NATO treaty. It was when, following September 11th attacks, when NATO declared Article 5 in defense of the United States. And then several NATO allies followed us into Afghanistan to help us prosecute our campaign against terrorism there. As it has evolved following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, it really entered a sort of not unsure of itself, maybe, phase that it's like, okay, so we're still here. We still want to work together, but we don't really have a defined threat that we're working against. And that's where it evolved into a counterterrorism focus in late 90s, most of the 2000s. However, and that's where you'll see a lot of the NATO countries have started scaling back on their defense spending. They didn't see an existential threat from the Soviet Union, so they weren't spending as much on defense. And that has become a huge criticism of the United States in the last couple of decades. As Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, has reestablished itself, become much more aggressive under Putin, you've seen a lot more refocus on NATO, revitalization of NATO, and a lot of countries have started stepping up with their defense commitments, both domestically and in collective defense. For example, Germany is going to spend something like $1 billion extra. I'd have to look at the specific figure. It escapes me at the moment, but they're ramping up their domestic production, that both their actual military and their defense industrial base, a significant amount starting this year going forward. And then, of course, following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, you had Sweden and Finland rather actually join NATO, and that was a huge thing. Now Russia has an additional third of its frontier that it has to defend against NATO countries rather than just Romania and Moldova down south. Not Moldova. It escapes me. My geography is escaping me at the moment, but it has to look north a lot more than it did before, is where I'm going with that.
Excellent points, Nick, and don't worry, we have a map here with everything in it, and so we can highlight anything that you want, and just kind of talking about NATO. Really want to highlight kind of a cyber aspect to this is cyber didn't exist really as a concept and a formalized concept when NATO, was first formed as a concept. And for those who may or may not be familiar, one of the earliest hacking cases that was ever tracked was the Cuckoo's Egg, which was Berkeley National Laboratories back in the mid to late 80s. And when this happened, it was actually East Germany and Germany that was involved in it, and the United States. So it's, a lot of people, I think they forget that there used to be that whole era of Eastern Germany, being very much aligned with Soviet Union. And so when you look at this nexus, it was not until Estonia was hacked as a country that it became a significant issue to start looking at, would cyber fall underneath Article 5? And eventually it was agreed that cyber attack could also be considered. And so far that's never been invoked yet, but it's definitely something that people are watching very closely now.
Yeah, and cyber is so much more challenging in that it really doesn't go by national boundaries, national borders. So you may have the instigator, the aggressor, may be in Russia or China, but their vectors for attacking you may be using servers in non-aligned countries or even in NATO countries. They could be hijacking servers in Poland or Spain that actually commit the actual attack. So how do you attribute that? It becomes a huge, huge issue. And I don't know that policy-wise we've really been able to adequately address that, at least not to my knowledge.
Well, I think really would have to be just so blatant and so egregious. There was no doubt. And, early on, it was thought Russia was going to dominate Ukraine in the cyber war. And Russia had been able to do this sort of hybrid warfare in the past with the neighboring countries like Georgia and the invasions of Crimea, for instance. But what they really found was that after some initial success, Ukraine was really able to come back from that.
Yeah, they were, but that actually leads me into, if I may segue a little bit, the evolving nature of war with drone warfare and how the drones have really taken over the battlefield in Ukraine. Russia has pushed that beyond Ukraine, and I think you highlighted earlier before we started today's conversation about how a lot of those Russian drones have been penetrating NATO airspace. Some right around Ukraine, including Poland and Romania, but not exclusively. There have been drones operating rather sort of ambiguously over Denmark and the UK. These are almost essentially guaranteed to be Russian drivers, but attributing it as really, really difficult. And then how do you deal with it? That has been yet to have a real definitive response to it. And additionally, it's not necessarily a new driver, but submarine warfare going back to the Cold War. The Russian submarine units have been doing some stuff with the transatlantic cables in the North Sea and off of the Irish coast that have really alarmed the British, the Irish, and NATO at large, because you cut those cables, and that's a pretty significant blow to cyber, to global communications.
Really excellent points. And so, Nick, we've done a lot of scene setting here about what NATO is, the history of NATO. Under the current administration, both the first Trump administration did some saber rattling and said, hey, NATO, start paying your bills. But this administration, Trump has actually threatened NATO allies, not even taking military action off the table for Greenland. He's also called for Spain to be removed from NATO. And so let's talk a little bit about what is this doing to the alliance?
Yeah, so the alliance is starting to look post-America. They're recognizing, at least under the current administration, the United States is not a reliable partner. As you mentioned, Trump has been demanding that the alliance take part in the campaign against Iran, despite the fact that the alliance was not consulted before the attacks. So it's like a post. Oh, the term escapes me. I'm not firing on all cylinders this morning, but the administration.
It's like starting a bar fight and then that your friends don't join in.
Exactly. Yeah. So,
there you go. That's time for the cocktail focus.
So the administration has said, well, if you're not going to back us up with this, then we may not back you up in a fight against whoever your adversary is, notably Russia, which terrifies the eastern flank. So they think the Baltic countries and Poland, and I'm pretty sure I've mentioned that before. So they're looking at how are we going to act if the United States doesn't come to our aid? And the Senate passed a bill during the Biden administration to prevent the president from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO. But that doesn't mean that the president can't take a lot of steps to undermine NATO. And we saw that this past week when President Trump said he was going to withdraw 5,000 troops from Germany. The German president has said, well, we kind of saw this coming, but we're going to adapt and we're going to overcome. President Trump, I don't think, understands and appreciates exactly what we get out of this relationship and this alliance. The logistics hubs alone in Germany permit us to project power into the Middle East. I think I mentioned this earlier, but when the missile defense ships that we had off the coast of Israel, when they ran out of missiles, they didn't sail back to the United States to reload. They sailed to Spain. And when we flowed in all the troops and assets from the United States to the Middle East, they flew through Europe. So without those logistics bases, we would be in a world of hurt for projecting global power the way we can do today. So that's something that the Trump administration does not appreciate at all.
And Nick, excellent point. Spain, Italy, Germany, all major bases located there where the U.S. is able to take advantage of that for logistics. Let's focus on the Greenland aspect. There were some hypotheticals that came out, and then Trump sort of backed off, but now there's more saber rattling going on about Greenland. We do have bases there. Greenland and Denmark, as the parent, has said, hey, we would even work with the United States to allow you to put in additional infrastructure, etc. What happens hypothetically if the U.S. were to have a military attack against Greenland, and so now it's a NATO ally attacking a NATO ally?
I played that through my head, and I honestly have no idea. So in theory, all of the other NATO allies would have to come to Denmark's defense because we would be the aggressor. How that would work in practice is really anybody's guess, because Canada, for example, which is a member of NATO, declaring war on the United States would be very disadvantageous to Canada. The rest of Europe is insulated to an extent by the Atlantic Ocean, but still, do they really, really want to go to war with the United States? And I imagine most of those countries are going to say no, particularly on the eastern edge. That takes away from their focus on Russia because they are absolutely terrified of Russia rolling through their eastern borders. So if the rest of Europe is distracted by looking west, that is a considerable threat. And I think it would the practical impact was it would be an end of NATO. I don't know how it would play out for the actual battle for Greenland. I can't speak to that extent. I've not war gamed that out. But the NATO alliance would be dead and gone. And I think in its place, the European Union would have to find some way to do some sort of collective defense mechanism for Europe specifically, and then just leave the United States out of it.
So effectively, Trump doesn't have to make a declaration on withdrawal. He just has to convince the military to do one of these actions.
In theory, but then I will say too that militarily attacking Greenland is probably a bridge too far for most members of Congress too. So I suspect even the Republican members of Congress that have been reticent to work against the Trump administration would push back against any sort of military action against Greenland. It's speculation on my part, maybe a little hopeful speculation, but I don't see it happening personally.
Right, but as we saw with Iran, anything can happen and kick off with very little warning and very little messaging to the American people. That is a fair point. If we started to see the sort of military buildup around the North Atlantic that we saw in the Middle East, if we moved 3 carrier strike groups up there and we started pre-positioning fighters, then maybe the bombers can reach easily from the continental United States. So there's that. But then if you're going to actually conquer a territory, you need to have troops to occupy it. You can't conquer from the air. But would the goal be to conquer Greenland, or would be the goal to dissolve NATO?
So Trump has said he wants Greenland as a territory. He wants it to be part of the United States. And if you're taking him at his word, then you're talking about conquering and holding territory, and you have to have ground forces to do that. If his goal is just to undermine NATO, he could certainly do that by attacking Greenland. I think he could probably do that through other more subtle means as well, such as withdrawing troops, such as trying to do some sort of economic penalties against European allies. So I think he has other tools if that's his goal.
So pretty fascinating situation that we're even having this conversation at this point.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up. I want to thank everybody. Please like, please subscribe. Please let us know topics that you want to hear about. We're trying to keep it timely. We're trying to keep it relevant. Let's hope that this declaration that for Iran that we've terminated this operation is correct and that we can move on. And then just as a gentle reminder, please call and message your congressional representatives. Cuba is out there starving. They don't have a way ahead. There has been no demands on what would make it successful. They are just waiting at this point.
Yeah. in the Cuba arena, I read an article earlier this week about how this fuel embargo is impacting their agricultural sector, and how there's going to be significant food shortages in the not too distant future down there. So it's not getting any better, and there's no move to resolve it that I've seen on the part of the United States government.
Right. And so, it's one thing to say we have demands of you, you're not meeting them. It's another thing to just say we're going to hold you hostage and not even have demands. I want to thank everybody for viewing. Please enjoy some cocktails, enjoy some current events, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.